Our story begins here. On the evening of July 5, 1882, 1 mile east of present-day Defiance, Iowa, a great railroad across the state of Iowa, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, was finished here. Construction crews working eastward from Council Bluffs, Iowa, and construction crews working westward from Perry, Iowa, met here in this field. It was a cause for great celebration. A special 3-car train carrying company officials from Milwaukee arrived on the scene at 9:30 p.m. This included the general manager of the company, the general superintendent of the company, and a 34-year-old man by the name of Albert Earling, a division superintendent of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. Lanterns and bonfires lit the scene as these important people disembarked from the train. They made speeches and congratulated the workers. Getting to this point had been a long, hard road, but now the moment was at hand. A silver spike was produced, placed into position, and Mr. Merrill, the general manager of the company, drove the final spike into its railroad tie. And with that, the western portion and the eastern portion of this 266-mile-long track was finally done. The next morning, shortly before noon, after a long night of celebration, the railroad officials reboarded their train. Mr. Nicholas, the train's engineer, gave a blast of the whistle. He opened up the steam valves, and the train inched forward, moving westward. Their next destination was Council Bluffs, where another celebration awaited. This final stretch of the track to Council Bluffs had been the most difficult to build. Severe weather beginning in the fall of 1881 had shut down the project. Blizzards, rain, and mud delayed the completion by at least 7 months. But the man who overcame these difficulties, the man in charge of finishing the project, was Mr. Earling. As the special train rolled down the track, he must have felt a sense of pride and satisfaction. Their route to Council Bluffs would take them past the locations of several new towns already being built alongside the tracks. These included Underwood, Neola, Persia, Portsmouth, Panama, and the all-important village of Marthan. Marthan had been designated as the first maintenance division town east of Council Bluffs. As such, it would have a turntable, an engine house, and several buildings assigned to the task of keeping the steam engines in top shape. On their way to Council Bluffs, a special train stopped at Marthan to look over the new facilities being constructed. Marthan's official town charter was signed on August 21, 1882. Today, the town of Marthan does not exist. That's because within 3 weeks of the signing of the town charter, the name was changed to Earling. The name was changed as a way of rewarding Albert Earling for a job well done, for having completed the trek across Iowa despite Mother Nature. Less than 2 years later, he would be promoted to Assistant General Superintendent of the company, and by 1899, he would be president of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. In those early days, Earling, the town, was important because of it being a maintenance division, but it would soon lose that status within just 4 years, when the maintenance division was moved eastward to Manila, Iowa. The loss of the maintenance division in 1886 was a huge economic blow to the new town. Many people lost their jobs. Other workers moved east to Manila, leaving many of Earling's houses vacant. Local businesses felt the impact. Some shut their doors. And all this had come after a huge, devastating fire in 1885 that destroyed many of Earling's businesses on the east side of Main Street. But something was about to happen that would bring forth hope from despair. It would rise from atop a nearby hill. The farmland that Earling then and today resides on was originally owned by 2 different farmers. John Miller was one of those farmers who lived just west of where the town is today. In 1879, he purchased 160 acres of prairie land in Section 5 of Westphalia Township and cleared it for farming. In 1881, however, the Milwaukee Land Company, a newly formed real estate entity for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, bought the land from him for a new town they were planning to build at that point along their soon-to-be constructed railroad. The land company also bought 100 acres from Joseph Kuhl, one of Shelby County's leading citizens at the time. In 1881, Joseph Kuhl became the first Catholic elected to county government in Shelby County when he was elected supervisor. Joseph Kuhl was the father of Earling. The Milwaukee Land Company was so impressed by him, they hired him to be their local land agent. This was an important role, one of many for Joseph Kuhl. Not only was he a farmer, a county supervisor, and a land agent, he was also the first postmaster of Earling and a pioneer businessman, opening up the first grain elevator in Earling and opening up a hardware store on Main Street that he operated with his brother Peter. It was out of the hardware store that he conducted business for the Milwaukee Land Company. Joseph Kuhl was in charge of selling lots in the town of Earling. Anyone wanting to buy a lot for a house or a place of business first had to drop by the Earling Hardware House and visit with Joe Kuhl. His reputation was that of a fair and decent man who worked hard for his town and his county. Throughout these early years of the 1880s, Joe Kuhl sold lots from all parts of the town, except for block number 2. For 4 years, he did not sell any lots in block 2. Obviously, Joe Kuhl had a plan for block 2. It was the center of town, bordering on Main Street. It occupied a prominent spot on the hill, overlooking the town. Would this not be a good place for a Catholic church? He knew the immigrants in the area were largely Catholic, many of them coming from Germany and Luxembourg, with more arriving every year. He knew the need would soon arise for a Catholic church to serve this population. But before a town could build a Catholic church, a town needed a Catholic priest. Joseph Hummert was ordained in September of 1885 by Bishop Henry Cosgrove of Davenport, Iowa. The following month, in October, Bishop Cosgrove sent Father Hummert to Portsmouth, Iowa, to be their pastor. Portsmouth, like Earling, was a new town along the railroad. Additionally, Earling and the neighboring town of Panama were assigned to Father Hummert as outmissions. This meant that on Sundays, Father Hummert had to travel to Earling and Panama to say Mass at a venue large enough to handle a big crowd. In Earling, that meant Schnitgen Hall on the east side of Main Street, in a building owned by August Schnitgen. The hall was located above Charles Flussy's drugstore and Schnitgen's hardware and furniture business. This arrangement went on for several months, but it was not the one the Earling people wanted. They wanted a proper church, as did Father Hummert. Father Hummert had overseen the establishment of 2 church buildings in Portsmouth and Panama, and by February of 1886, he was turning his attention to getting a church built in Earling. This notice appeared in the Harlan Tribune newspaper in February of 1886. Harlan was and is the county seat in Shelby County, Iowa. There were 2 competing newspapers in Harlan at the time. The members of the Catholic Church at Earling contemplate building a religious edifice next summer, read the notice. To achieve this goal, Father Hummert enlisted the help of John Carl Hazy, otherwise known as J.C. Hazy. J.C. Hazy owned one of the local lumber yards at the time. Earling had 2 lumber yards in 1886, but J.C. Hazy's would be the one that would stand the test of time. In the summer of 1886, they began construction on a wood frame building that was 36 feet wide and 64 feet long. There are no standalone pictures of this building. Our view of it is from group pictures of other buildings taken years later, where only glimpses of this building can be seen. Based on those views, however, and what is known about the building's internal arrangement, this 3-dimensional model of the building is a fairly accurate representation of what it looked like when it was new. This building was dedicated as St. Mary's Catholic Church at Earling in February of 1887. But it would serve as more than just a church. Up to this point, none of the new railroad towns had a Catholic school. Father Hummert changed that when he opened St. Mary's Catholic School in this building. When he did that, Bishop Cosgrove decided to make Father Hummert pastor of Earling exclusively, so that he could oversee the school. Father Hummert moved from Portsmouth to Earling, and he established his parsonage on the upper attic level of this building. The first floor was used for classrooms, and the second floor served as the church gathering place for the parish congregants. By 1888, Father Hummert realized that he and his young parish needed help to run this new school. He made a request to the School Sisters of St. Francis in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a religious order of nuns dedicated to serving the religious needs of new immigrants coming to America. Father Hummert asked Mother Alexia Howell, the leader of the order, to please send a delegation of nuns to Earling to teach in the new school. She agreed. With the impending arrival of the School Sisters of St. Francis in Earling, Father Hummert knew that the parish would need another building. In the summer of 1888, he began building a new parsonage on the southeast corner of block number 2. By October, the new parsonage was completed. Father Hummert vacated the attic level of the original church building, and the School Sisters of St. Francis took over its occupancy. This would remain their home for the next 16 years. Today, nothing remains of Earling's original church and school, except for this. The bell that rang out from its steeple, calling parishioners to Mass and children to school. This bell and a larger companion bell reside in a different steeple today. Even in 1888, when this building was still new, it was never destined to be the church building in Earling. Its location in block number 2 was not the most prominent area of that block. That area was seemingly being reserved for something grander. Earling's parishioners were largely European immigrants. The old world churches they had known were made of brick and mortar, and no doubt some of those churches had inspired awe and wonder. Now, in their new home, Earling's immigrant population wanted something similar. Before the paint was hardly dry on their new wood frame building, this notice appeared in the Harlan Tribune in December of 1888, announcing the first fundraiser for a new church and the expectation that construction would begin on that church in the spring of 1889. This was over-optimistic, as construction did not begin in the spring. However, in another Catholic community, not too far away in Breda, Iowa, construction of a new Gothic-styled Catholic church had just been completed in May of 1889. And so, Father Hummert organized a building committee that included J.C. Hazy, John Miller, Nicholas Gall, August Schnicken, and Wenzel Hahn. They boarded a train, and they took a trip to Breda to see this new church, St. Barnard's Church, that everyone had been talking about. They were impressed. They learned the church had been built by Matthias Schnell of Rock Island, Illinois, from a plan that had been purchased from his firm. Whether or not he was the architect who drew up the plan is not known. Nevertheless, over the course of his lifetime, Matthias Schnell had erected over 114 structures. Father Hummert and the building committee were so captivated by what they saw, they purchased a set of identical plans from Schnell. And on January 7, 1892, this notice appeared in the Shelby County Republican newspaper, seeking a contractor to build the church from these plans. Some previous histories about the church implied that Schnell himself had erected it. He did not. Father Hummert merely purchased the plan from him. The actual contractor who won the bid and who would go on to erect Earling's first brick and mortar church was William H. Cockerell of Harlan. William Cockerell was an Englishman who had come to this country in 1870 at the age of 19. He had been a bricklayer since the age of 15, working for his father. When he came to America, he moved to Chicago, and in 1871 he was in Chicago during the infamous Chicago Fire. In 1874, he moved to Mishawaka, Indiana. He married and started his own general contracting business. 5 years later, he settled in Harlan and began erecting buildings in and around Shelby County, most of which still stand today. In 1882, he was the general contractor who built the church at Westphalia, St. Boniface. Built with largely volunteer labor, Cockerell proved that even though he was a young Englishman, he could organize and direct a bunch of Germans into an efficient workforce. He would be doing much the same 10 years later when he began building Earling's church. 1892 would be the year that would cement Cockerell's legacy as the man who built Shelby County. Not only had he won the bid to build Earling's church, he also was responsible that year for building two other Shelby County landmarks, the Shelby County Courthouse in Harlan and the Shelby County State Bank building in Harlan. 17 miles of rough country roads separated the towns of Harlan and Earling. There was no motorized transport. There was no direct rail connection between the towns. To get from Harlan to Earling and back again meant a trip with horses that would have taken approximately 2 hours each way. This made Cockerell's building feats all the more impressive that year, given that all three projects were happening simultaneously. Because of the weather, things started very slowly at Earling. It wasn't until the 12th of May that the foundation work really began in earnest, with the digging of trenches, the laying of limestone, and the installation of pilings for the columns that would support the church. By the latter part of June, however, they were ready to lay the cornerstone. This was a well-attended event. 700 people turned out. Bishop Henry Cosgrove traveled from Davenport to officiate. 6 additional priests from around the area joined with Father Hummert to commemorate this special event. With the completion of the foundation, the brickwork could begin. As in Westphalia 10 years before, Cockerell organized a local workforce of both townspeople, perhaps some of these men seen here on the main street from a photograph of that era, and farmers to haul building materials from both the Earling Depot and the Hazy Lumberyard using their horses and wagons. It was a steep climb up that hill, even for draft horses, and many such climbs had to be made over the course of that summer. But as the weeks went by, and the calendar turned to fall, an impressive sight took shape on that hill. Harlan Tribune took note when the exterior brickwork was finished by late September, a mere 3 months after the cornerstone had been laid. With the exterior work completed, attention could be turned to the interior and the creation of the intricate groin vaults that form the ceiling of the nave and the side naves, a combination of plaster laths, and craftsmanship. It took nearly 3 months to transform this simulated interior into the one seen here in this photograph, and in this one. A quick tour of this photograph shows many details. The main altar cost $850. The money was donated by the ladies of the parish through a series of $10 donations. The main altar and the side altars were crafted by the DePrado Regali Studios of Chicago, a company still doing business today. In fact, DePrado Regali seems to have been the source of many of the elements that adorn the interior, including these cathedral windows, each of which was donated by an individual family. The pulpit seen here in the northeast corner was donated by a Kenkel family. The intricate fresco paintings on the walls of the nave were paid for with a $400 donation. The communion rail would have been a much more expensive item, and probably several donations were needed to pay for it. Here on the west wall of the church, a statue of St. Francis of Assisi can be seen. He's flanked by 2 stations of the cross. In the church of 1892, the statues of 12 saints were posted on the west, south, and east walls, guarding the church in effect. Again, like other items, the statues were donated by prominent members of the parish. My own great-grandfather, Theodore Schnitgen, donated one of them, and he insisted it had to be a statue of St. Theodore. The chandeliers seen here were gas chandeliers, and they had to be lowered from the ceiling in order to be lit, which meant somebody had to go into the attic and crank them down. By early December of 1892, the work on the new church had been completed. It had only taken 8 months. As the dedication day approached, both Harlan papers gave the new church glowing reviews. The Shelby County Republican called it one of the finest church edifices in western Iowa, and the Harlan Tribune called it an architectural gem. Once again, Bishop Cosgrove made the trip out from Davenport for the dedication. The weather on dedication day was terrible. Heavy snow made the roads impassable, but the parishioners of Earling were not about to stay home. They filled the new church, and on December 13th, 1892, Bishop Henry Cosgrove formally dedicated the new church as St. Joseph Catholic Church at Earling. This new church on the hill gave Earling an identity. Its steeple, rising nearly 150 feet above the uncluttered prairie landscape, could be seen for miles around and would become the focal point in the spiritual lives of all Catholics who live beneath its shadow. Father Joseph Hummert, a mere 32 years old at the time, had accomplished a monumental task. The building of this church would be his defining achievement. It would be 12 years before the parish erected another building. In 1904, it became apparent that more room was needed in the school for classrooms. Father Hummert decided to erect a new parsonage on the west side of the new church, which subsequently became known as the rectory. Meanwhile, the vacated parsonage on the east side of the church was now available to accommodate the School Sisters of St. Francis, and this building henceforth became known as the convent. This in turn freed up the attic level of the original church and school for more classrooms. For the next 8 years, this building arrangement would be the status quo. In 1912, Father Hummert and the parish decided to build a new school, and this building, the original St. Mary's Church and School, was torn down. It disappears from the pages of Earling history after 24 years of service. The new school, seen here, was built in the spring and summer of 1912. Its larger size would accommodate more students and eventually a high school. This would be the last building project undertaken while Father Hummert was pastor. For 26 years, Earling had known only one pastor. But as early as 1907, Father Hummert had been experiencing health problems that forced him away from the parish for long periods of time. Increasingly, his assistants were assuming more of the responsibilities for running the parish. Finally, in 1913, Father Hummert retired from active pastoral duties at the age of 52. He would pass away in 1926. Father Bartholomew Kuppenbender replaced Father Hummert as pastor in 1913. He was 64 at the time, which, by the standards of 1913, would have seemed older than by the standards of today. Earling was a large parish with a school and many responsibilities to look after, and perhaps it was a bit overwhelming to an older man. Beginning in 1916, Father Kuppenbender starts receiving periodic visits from this younger priest, Father Joseph Steiger. Joseph Steiger immigrated to the United States in 1899 at the age of 18. He came from Julbach, Bavaria, an area in Germany with a strong Catholic Benedictine heritage. Upon his arrival in this country, he joined the lay brethren of the Benedictine religious order and took as his religious name Adolf. For some years thereafter, he was known as Brother Adolf Steiger. He joined the Cluny Benedictine Priory in Weetag, Illinois. Clunaic Benedictines practiced a stricter form of monastic life. The priory at Weetag, Illinois, failed in 1901, however, when its leader, Father Oswald Moosmüller, another native of Bavaria, Germany, died of pneumonia. The Benedictine Abbey at Collegeville, Minnesota, St. John's, took charge of the failed priory and offered its delegation of priests, monks, and brothers an opportunity to immigrate to Saskatchewan, Canada, to start a new Benedictine monastery there to serve a rapidly increasing population of German immigrants moving into the area. Brother Adolf Steiger was a part of the founding delegation of Benedictines who went to Saskatchewan in May of 1903 and started the St. Peter's Monastery. Conditions there were grueling and harsh. They had few resources. But within just a few short years, they built up a remarkable campus. At some point during his time in Saskatchewan, Brother Adolf Steiger made the decision to become a Benedictine priest. In 1907, he entered the St. Meinrad Benedictine Abbey in Meinrad, Indiana, where there was a college and a seminary, and he began a 7-year course of studies to become a priest. He chose at Meinrad to go by his baptismal name of Joseph. In 1914, 15 years after arriving in North America and taking a circuitous journey through Benedictine society, he was ordained to the priesthood. Here we see him with his graduating class at Meinrad in 1914. After his ordination, he said his first Mass at St. Boniface Church in Westphalia, where he had a sponsor by the name of Vitus Scheckinger that had helped him financially during his years at the monastery. He subsequently became part of the Des Moines Diocese, newly established in 1911. In the fall of 1915, Bishop Austin Dowling appointed him pastor of the Rosemont Parish in Warren County, southeast of Des Moines. St. Mary's Church at Rosemont, a wood frame building similar to what Earling had initially, awaited Father Steiger. Father Steiger, 34 years old at the time, less than 2 years out of the seminary and starting his first pastoral assignment, decided this church wasn't adequate. Rosemont needed a new church. For that, Father Steiger needed a plan. And for that, he in turn needed an architect. He found one, and in 1916, construction began on the new church at Rosemont. The laying of the cornerstone took place on June 8, 1916. In this article, there's a clue as to who may have been the architect for this new church in Rosemont. One of the attending priests at the cornerstone ceremony was a man by the name of Father Charles Dolman. Charles Dolman had some things in common with Father Steiger. Like Steiger, he was a younger man of 28. He too had immigrated from Germany, coming over in 1908. And again, like Steiger, he was considered by his superiors to be an energetic priest, one who was motivated to get things done. He was the pastor at Lacona, Iowa, just a few miles south of Rosemont. He was also the visiting pastor for the parishes of Bauer, Iowa, and Melker, Iowa, near Dallas. A year earlier, in 1915, Dolman, too, had built a new church, the Sacred Heart Catholic Church of Melker. This church, described as a modest wood frame structure and built at a cost of $5,000, had been designed by Father Dolman's own father, famed architect Anton Dohmen of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. By 1916, Anton Dohmen's reputation as an exceptional designer of churches was well established. He had come to America from Bavaria, Germany in 1892 and lived in this house in Milwaukee with his wife and family. In 1895, he opened up his own architectural practice in Milwaukee, specializing in the design of religious buildings. While many of his churches were built in and around the state of Wisconsin, his most famous churches are some of those in North and South Dakota. For many years, he worked closely with a Benedictine priest and bishop there by the name of Vincent Worley. Their working relationship created some of the most magnificent churches in the country. In 1916, Father Joseph Steiger, another Benedictine priest, needed an architect to design a new church for him in Rosemont. When he took over at Rosemont, the nearest neighboring priest that he could talk to and consult with was Charles Dolman. Dolman, a fellow countryman, was just a few miles away and had recently gone through the church-building process himself. If he sought Dolman's counsel on this matter, and that seems likely, who better to recommend to Steiger than dear old Dad. And that is exactly what happened. This is the contract signed between Father Steiger and Anton Dohmen on March 18, 1916, upon the completion of the blueprints for the new church at Rosemont. The cost of the church was budgeted at $11,933. Construction began almost immediately, as the aforementioned cornerstone ceremony took place on June 8th. By late summer, the church was completed. This is how the church appeared in 1996, after it had been painstakingly restored by the parishioners of the parish. Unfortunately and sadly, this beautiful church no longer exists. It was destroyed in a senseless, tragic arson fire in 2004. But in 1916, and for many decades after that, it was the pride of Rosemont. The cause and effect of history is demonstrated here. If Father Steiger hadn't met Charles Dolman, the son of Anton Dohmen, when he became pastor of Rosemont, he probably would never have met Anton Dolman. And if he hadn't met Anton Dolman, the events which took place next might never have occurred. At least, not in the way they did. Those events were about to take place in Earling. The newspaper record shows that starting in 1916 and continuing into 1917, Father Steiger drops in on Father Kuppenbender in Earling from time to visit. In view of what happened next, these courtesy calls might have been something more. Because suddenly, in June of 1917, Father Steiger and Father Kuppenbender swap parishes. Father Steiger, the younger, ambitious priest, comes to Earling, a growing, expanding parish, while the older Father Kuppenbender goes to Rosemont, a smaller parish with perhaps fewer stressful challenges, but now with a brand new church. And as it turns out, Father Kuppenbender had been in Rosemont years earlier. It might have seemed the perfect arrangement for both men. The swap had to be approved by Bishop Austin Dowling, but that may have been a mere formality. Meanwhile, this change did not take place in a vacuum, because by June of 1917, the United States had already entered the First World War. It was an awkward time for communities that were largely made up of German immigrants and their first-generation children. German communities across the Midwest had to demonstrate their loyalty. Earling was no exception. This was done in many ways. The word German was removed from business establishments and advertising. In Earling, the German Savings Bank becomes the Farmers Trust and Savings Bank. But most importantly, German communities demonstrated their loyalty by the commitment of their young men to the war effort. This is a list of the men who, in June of 1917, the very month Father Steiger arrived in Earling, registered their names as being eligible for military service. 2 big war rallies were held in Earling in September and November of that year, and Father Steiger gave the keynote address in both of them. Imagine the difficulty of that. A Catholic priest pledged to the peace of the Gospels, a first-generation immigrant, only 18 years removed from his native land, having to urge a war effort against that native land. In December of 1917, the first group of Earling men went off to join the war effort. And while the public face of the war effort may have been filled with bravado, it had to be a dark and uncertain time for families and communities worrying about what the future held for its children of fighting age. However, as the calendar changed to 1918, and despite the pace of worldly events, Earling's new pastor had made a big decision. Earling needed a new church, or perhaps more accurately, Earling needed to transform its present church. The announcement by Father Steiger of his decision had to have been a stunner, at least for some parishioners who had labored hard to build the church and who had contributed to its costs. It was only 26 years old, and it was already the largest church in the county. But Father Steiger wanted to make it bigger. For a community of German and Luxembourg immigrants, people known for their thrift and practicality, it must have been a cause for consternation, at least in private. But in those days, pastors in Catholic communities led those communities, and if they wanted to get something done, they generally found a way to do it. And in Earling's case, a declaration of war against his native land wasn't about to dissuade Father Steiger from pursuing his vision for Earling's St. Joseph's Catholic Church. But how to realize that vision? That would be no problem. Father Steiger obviously knew the perfect man for the job. Once again, he called upon the talents of Anton Dohmen. The Earling transformation would be a complicated project, and Steiger needed somebody he knew and trusted, because he was about to take the axe to an already beautiful church. Anton Dohmen came to Earling, surveyed the church, gathered up the old plans, and returned to Milwaukee and drew up his plans to transform Earling's church into a cruciform church, a church that from above would have the shape of a cross, a classic design that had been popular in Europe for centuries. By March, the plans were complete. Seen here, the main feature of the plan called for the creation of a huge transept dome and two side balcony wings that would dramatically increase the size and scale of the church. The overall length of the church would increase by 30 feet. The overall width in the transept area would increase by 30 feet. The dome would be suspended 38 feet above the floor of the church. All the windows in the church would be removed and replaced with new stained glass windows designed by Carl Reimann, an artisan from Milwaukee. 4 existing windows would be closed up entirely to make way for additional entries to the church and access to the balconies. All the existing woodwork in the church would be torn out and replaced, including the choir railing, so that all the woodwork would match. This meant new pews would have to be purchased for the main floor. The cornice details atop the support columns would be replaced. The stations of the cross would be replaced. The statues would be moved and placed high atop the support columns. A new vigil light grotto would be added to the rear of the church. The entire church would be wired for electricity, and an entirely new heating system would be installed with the creation of a powerhouse on the north side of the church with a central heating plant that would heat all the parish buildings with steam radiators. The scope and scale of the planned transformation were breathtaking. Anton Dohmen himself would spend over 8 weeks in Earling, living in the rectory and overseeing the most crucial phases of the construction. Contractors he trusted from Milwaukee would spend months in Earling doing the work. But before construction could begin, the demolition of Earling's church had to be done. Using hammers, saws, and wrecking bars, The disquieting work of deconstruction was done in June of 1918. The entire north end of the church was torn off. This included the sacristy, the sanctuary, and 2 sections of the nave. The resulting view of the church had to be disturbing for at least some of the parishioners, a picture of rubble and debris and devastation. This then was the view from Main Street of Earling's beloved church in July of 1918. Reconstruction would begin during the latter half of that month. And while the weather was nice, masses were said outdoors. But as the weather turned colder in the fall, masses were held in the school's upper floor auditorium. It was a chaotic time in the fall of 1918, brought on by the confluence of events. The church was in a state of disruptive transformation. The demands for contributions to fund the project were ongoing. The country was at war. Young men from Earling had gone off to fight in that war. And then, perhaps the most devastating event in the history of the world took place. It started quietly, growing in strength around the world throughout much of 1918. But then, in October, it struck with a vengeance. The flu epidemic of 1918 would kill 50 million people worldwide, including people in Shelby County and in Earling in the latter months of 1918. 1 out of every 4 people was affected. In the United States alone, 195,000 people died in the month of October. William Langenfeld had gone off to fight in the war, but he fell ill at Camp Devens in Massachusetts before he was to ship out to France, and passed away, the first flu death of an Earling individual. His brother traveled to Massachusetts and brought him home. To this day, there is a window in Earling's church honoring his memory. More deaths would follow in Earling, including Joseph and Mary Klepper and Joseph Altman. Many more fell ill. On October 24th, the school in Earling closed for 3 weeks because of the flu. It would close again in December for several more weeks for the same reason. The mail carriers in Earling were unable to deliver the mail for 10 days because of the flu. And while this worldwide pandemic unfolded, the work of transforming Earling's church continued unabated. These reports in the Harlan Tribune kept people apprised. The Stin Implement Company had begun wiring. Clarence Dole from Omaha had commenced plastering. The new addition is done. Work on the old part has started. The plastering is progressing rapidly. The carpenters are busy doing the finishing. Meanwhile, the war in Europe ended. The armistice was signed on November 11th. In Earling, the Kaiser was burned in effigy, but the troops were coming home. It was a countdown to Christmas Day, and at 5 o'clock on Christmas morning, the doors were opened for the first Mass in the newly transformed St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Earling. After a year of war, death, tragedy, and uncertainty, all must have seemed right with the world again. And what the people saw when they entered that church on that Christmas morning are many of the same things we still see today. Earling's church had been transformed into a true cruciform church, and while the reason given to the people for expanding it may officially have been to increase its capacity, turning it into a cruciform church with a transept dome and beautiful stained glass windows was a way of paying tribute to God and showing that the people of Earling were a people of faith. This seems more likely the real motivation for Father Steiger undertaking what he and Anton Dohmen had done. No one has ever argued the results. For the past 100 years, much has been done to maintain this church, to keep it the magnificent church on the hill that Joe Kuhl had envisioned so many years ago. Every generation has done its part. Every future generation will do its part. The church on the hill, Earling's St. Joseph's Catholic Church, will stand the test of time.